Hello, and welcome to a new series that I'm doing with Iconic, in which I'm going to take sections from my books over the last, 35 years, and talk about those subjects, but also talk about how the research came to me and how the information was pulled together. And I've written nearly 30 books now. And it's a shame that, the information in them is phenomenal. I mean, you'll see here the size of that one. And it's a shame that it's not kind of circulating some of the older books as I think it needs to, because I've been on this journey now since 1990, consciously anyway, and I've picked up knowledge, information in that period that kind of, as things move on, kind of gets pushed back a bit. And forgotten about, and new things come along. Okay, it's fine. But it's the idea of this series is that I have a look at some of that stuff. And in this period of decades, I've met so many people and had so many experiences that have, in totality, brought together the knowledge as a whole. And what I've done with the books over the years is there's certain things that I repeat, like some of the things about the nature of reality. And I do that on purpose because what I'm looking at is not something that is sometime over the rainbow, whenever. I'm looking at something that's moving in terms of this conspiracy for a global dystopia. It's moving fast. And what I have not wanted to do is leave out things that are relevant to understanding the whole out of each book. And said, oh no, well, to understand more about this, you need to read this book, and then you'll get what I mean in this one. So I try to make every book kind of in and of itself, but every single one of these has its own character and its own emphasis. For instance, I'm just looking at The Trigger. Now, the emphasis of that is obviously 9/11. And who really was behind it. And it wasn't 19 Arab hijackers. So each book has its own character and its own focus, but there are common themes through them. And when I look back at some of the books, it amazes me how the common themes that I'm talking about now, but in more detail, were there right back towards the start. And what I want to do today in this first show in the series is look at something that is really topical, just a little bit, the pedophile rings, and I would say the satanic rings that connect with them. And as I'm speaking, of course, you've got this big furore in the United States relating to Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump, and the fact that the Trump regime, i.e. Trump, doesn't want the files released, the documentation released, so that we can see the real background to what Jeffrey Epstein was doing. And what was he doing? He was running a blackmail operation for Israel, for Mossad, their intelligence agency, in league with all these other organizations in Israel, like the Israeli Defense Forces, that actually move as one unit. And so it's kind of interesting, isn't it, that it's now well documented, even more, and more's coming out all the time, that Donald Trump was, in Epstein's words, his closest friend for 10 years, actually longer, but 10 years, he says. And then they fell out over some real estate deal, where it seems that Trump tried to screw him over a property. But then, after this close friendship, in the very period that Epstein was doing all this, that eventually he got charged with, that then along comes Donald Trump to run for president. And he wins twice. And what does he do in office? The second term, the same, in fact, even more extreme. He gives Israel everything it wants. And maybe anyone suffering from terminal naivety might think that they're not connected, but clearly they are. So what I want to do in this first show is look at a chapter in this book, The Perception Deception, where I focus on the global pedophile and satanic rings and how they connect into politics, into royalty, into the system in general. And they are, in fact, almost like the cement that holds the global cult, as I call it, together. And one of the things, of course, that comes from this is that if you can either pull people you want to control, like politicians, potential politicians, into these particularly pedophile rings, then you got them. Because if they don't do what you say, you give them an ultimatum. You say, well, all this stuff can come out, mate, all over the front pages, or you can do what we tell you and everything's going to be fine and you'll make lots of money and you'll become very famous. So what would most people do in those circumstances? They'd go along with it. They'd give, for instance, Israel everything it wants. And it was in the 1990s, maybe about 95, 96, that I started to see the connection between the networks of human control and pedophilia and Satanism. So in this book, The Perception Deception, and this chapter on this subject, my opening sentence is, Satanism is at the top of the control system hierarchy, and this connects in the overall network with the rings within rings structure, in which Satanism, the upper levels of the major and most exclusive secret societies, Rothschild Zionism, as I was calling it then, and the pedophile networks operate as one unit. And I go into many examples. But before I do that, as I start this chapter here, why? Okay, you can see the blackmail side of it. Yeah, fine. And that's powerful. But there has to be other reasons for why Satanism and and pedophilia are so important to this global cult and its networks. And as the years unfolded, and the Perception Deception came out in 2013, I started to realize that, first of all, this goes back to the 1990s, actually about the same time I started understanding this, to the fact that ultimately this reality is controlled by a non-human force. And it's a non-human force that feeds off human low vibrational energy, fear, depression, hatred, regret, conflict, revenge, all these low vibrational emotions, and particularly a really powerful expression of this energy is terror. And when they're doing their human sacrifices, often children, imagine the terror that's coming off these people. But the things that apply in these, if you like, satanic rituals in a particular place, the same means of vampiring this energy from the population is going on globally. I mean, how many or how long do people go between fearing something, being anxious about something? It's happening. It's like a background white noise because of the way society is structured. There's always something to worry about, people think. There's always something to be anxious about. So I quote here a guy, and I've heard this from so many different people in different cultures around the world. I quote a guy called Don Juan Matus, who was a Central American Indian kind of shaman, who was quoted in the books of Carlos Castaneda. I think the last one was towards the end of the 90s. And so here's a quote from Don Juan Matus in Central America. And it's pretty much a quote I've heard from shamans around the world in different cultures. He said, he explained that sorcerers, another word for shamans, I guess, in his way of speaking, saw infant human beings as strange luminous balls of energy covered from the top to the bottom with a glowing coat, something like a coat of plastic adjusted tightly around the cocoon of energy. He said that glowing coat of awareness was what the predators, this non-human force operating outside of human sight, consumed, and that when a human reached adulthood, all that was left of that fringe awareness was a narrow fringe that went from the ground to the top of the toes. That fringe permitted mankind to keep on living, but only barely. And this fits with what I've been writing over the years about how this non-human force operating, like I say, it's in a dimension they call the astral, just outside of human sight, is feeding off this energy because it's been known by even orthodox science for a long, long time now, that every time we think and every time we feel emotion, we're generating frequencies. And the nature of the frequency relates to the nature of the thought and emotion. So when you're in these states of fear and anxiety and so on, depression, you're in a low frequency state. And these entities are feeding off that energy. And this global cult represents that force within the human reality, and thus works to generate that energy coming from people. So you have wars, you have deprivation, you have hunger, you have fear, anxiety about the future. All these things are kind of part of human life. But when it comes down to this pedophilia and Satanism, as Don Juan Matus talked about there, and like I say, I've heard this from so many different sources around the world, through pedophilia, they are drawing this energy from children as they are drawing this energy from the terror of the sacrifice in satanic rituals. And it's been clear to me for decades now that these entities, these non-human force, wants most of all the energy of children before puberty happens. Because we see puberty as a chemical change, a hormonal change. But actually, that hormonal chemical change is an expression of a frequency change in the energetic field of the young at that point. And they want that energy before. And that's why pedophilia is such a focus of these people that operate in this cult. So, what I do in perception deception is look at some of the detailed background. And I say here, widespread pedophilia is insurance for these entities that the Gnostics called archons, that sex with children will continue generation after generation, and so ensure a continuing supply of the children's energy. The Roman Catholic Church and other religions are major centers for what I call possessed pedophiles, because for me, these pedophiles are basically possessed by these entities. And so when how can I put it? When the abuse is going on, the entity is drawing off the energy of the child and absorbing it. So I say the Roman Catholic Church and other religions are major centers for these possessed pedophiles. I mean, look at the stories that appear about the Roman Catholic Church over the years. And I say here, so are children's homes and ironically named child protection services, who are kidnapping ever more children from loving parents for the outrageous and spurious reasons they make up. And they're awarded government financial incentives to do so. So the thing is that if your focus is the energy of children, then wherever you have children under your control, like children's homes and what have you, that's perfect for you. And that's why so many scandals have happened over the years relating to abuse of children in so-called care homes, which I'll get into as I go along with this chapter. And I quote here, figures from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reveal that 60% of runaway victims of sex trafficking in the United States have been in the custody of child protection services. And a 2011 audit found that the addresses of more than 1,000 registered sex offenders matched those of licensed foster care facilities and homes in the Sacramento area alone. So I'm not saying here that everybody that works in a care home for kids and foster parents, etc., are involved in a pedophile ring. Of course, I'm not saying that. What I am saying, and the evidence confirms it, is that these situations with fostering kids and the care home networks are absolutely used by these people to abuse children. So I'm writing here about the interlocking rings involving people in all walks of life, from politics, law enforcement. That's why so many of these people get away with it. Judiciary, banking, corporations, and media. And they watch each other's backs because their own backs depend on it. And children's homes and government mind control programs are a major source of children for the American elite. And I quote here a place called Boys Town in Nebraska. It was once known as Father Flanagan's Boys Home, after its founder, a Roman Catholic priest called Father Edward J. Flanagan. Established it was in 1921 for the, quote, care, treatment, and education of at-risk children. And I went to America in 1996 to talk about the conspiracy. And I wasn't talking to anybody in those days. I mean, nobody seemed to be interested. You know, I was talking to a handful of people and lots of empty chairs. But what happened on that trip in 1996 and subsequent ones in the following year and onwards is that I started gathering enormous amounts of information on lots of subjects, but particularly this one. And what shocked me was not that this pedophile abuse and satanic abuse was happening. You know, if it's possible to happen, it will be happening somewhere. What shocked me was the bloody scale of it. It's extraordinary. And so when you're looking at something like the Epstein ring, you're looking at the tip of 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 the tip and ongoing of what's actually happening. It's everywhere. And I came across a book by a former Nebraska state senator called John W. DeCamp. And he was exposing the Boys Town abuse. And he particularly highlighted a guy called Lawrence King. Now, DeCamp was actually investigating a financial scam relating to something called the Franklin Credit Union, as I remember, in Omaha, Nebraska. And as he kind of uncovered the financial scam, he started to realize it was connected to this vast pedophile network. And Lawrence King was massively connected to the Republican Party in the United States. Knew people like Father George Bush and so on. So much so that Lawrence King sang the American national anthem at the Republican conventions in 1984 and 1988. But what DeCamp found is that this guy was supplying children to the rich and famous, not least politicians. It's going to become quite a theme as we go along. And Lawrence King was eventually sent down for various things, but the real perpetrators, famous perpetrators, they all got away with it, as usual. Which brings me to the extraordinary example of what I'm talking about that related to the BBC entertainer, it says here, called Jimmy Savile. Jimmy Savile, for those younger than me and around the world, was what they called in the 1960s this new kind of term, a disc jockey, a DJ. And he appeared on BBC music programs, pop music programs like Top of the Pops and stuff like that. And he appeared to be a very strange guy, very eccentric, what people called a character. But in fact, behind that front was a very, very different man. And he was eventually exposed as a record-breaking pedophile. I'll come to that in a second. But as I uncovered more and more and more of these rings, not just in America, but in Britain, other places too, but those two in particular, it became clear to me that the reason, when it finally came out about Savile, that he'd never been arrested, even though the police knew about him, was because his real, the real depth of the rabbit hole was that he was, like Lawrence King, supplying children for the rich and famous, including politicians. And as we'll get into as we go along here, his connections to the British royal family are, shall we say, on the face of it, unexplainable. So he died in 2011 at the age of 84. And he'd been close to the British royal family from the 1960s, when he was brought into the inner circle of the British royal family. He's a disc jockey, plays records by a guy called Lord Mountbatten. Lord Mountbatten was a notorious paedophile and was the mentor, well publicized, to the then Prince Charles and Prince Philip. But I'll get more into that as we go along. But Mountbatten brought Savile into the British royal family. So what happened after he died in 2011? Because he was threatening anyone who got even close, he was threatening with legal action and all that stuff. But when he died, about a year after, there was an expose documentary on ITV, the independent television channel. It's not, but it was very good on this. That exposed him. And within weeks of that program going out, 450 people of both sexes had made complaints about Savile, involving 28 police areas throughout the country, and among them were 34 alleged rapes. They spanned a period, wait for this, of 54 years between 1955 and 2009, when Savile was 82. The abuses happened to 23 children and young people on BBC premises and at 14 hospitals and at least one hospice. More than 70% of his victims were under 18 and one as young as 8. Now, what Savile did, apart from play records, was also front up a BBC program which became very famous and very well known, very well watched, called Jim'll Fix It. And what he used to do was children would write in saying, I'd like to do this or I'd like to meet this person, and Jim would fix it. Actually, the production staff would fix it. And this was another connection into children, and there were endless numbers because he also did a lot of work for charity, Jimmy Savile, and a lot of that involved kind of children's homes, not least one on Jersey, which I'll come to in the Channel Islands. And he was able, like I say, to get away with all this because although the police knew about it, this is well known now, or well confirmed now, they did nothing about it because these rings go into all these different institutions. And therefore, he found it easy. I mean, he said at one point in an interview that he was untouchable. He didn't obviously make it clear what he was untouchable for, but he was untouchable to the day he died. And another thing is that, as I have said in The Perception, Deception, and in so many books over the years, these pedophile rings and satanic rings are connected because they're both connected to these non-human entities outside of human sight. And it's about energy, not least the energy of children. And Savile was famous for running marathons for charity, but also volunteering to be a porter at Leeds Infirmary or General Infirmary. And I thought, oh yeah, that's Jimmy Savile. He's a good guy. He volunteers as a porter, which gave him access to the mortuary. It gets really sick now because he was what they call a necrophiliac. He wanted to have sex with dead bodies. This is the level of depravity that we're talking about, that these rings operate in. So Savile's fellow BBC presenter, I say here, Paul Burnett, said without knowing the significance, he did a lot of work as a porter in the Leeds hospital that he collected money for. He would go there at night and work as a porter. And Paul Gambaccini, another BBC contemporary of Savile, confirmed that Savile was a necrophiliac. Now, one of the sources about Savile was a lady called Christine Fitzgerald, who for 9 years was a close friend of Princess Diana. And she spilled the background to me. I still have the tape somewhere. It's one of those reel-to-reel tapes had in those days, in which she told me about many things, some of which I'll get into in the other shows in this series. But on this, she told me about Savile and the fact that Princess Diana couldn't stand him. And he was a very close friend, Jimmy Savile, of Prince Charles, now King Charles. And I mean, it just tells you something profound, that Charles used Jimmy Savile, this pedophile supplier of children to rich and famous pedophiles, used him as a go-between between him and Diana when the marriage was breaking down. And on this whole subject of Satanism, it's become clear that Savile was also into satanic ritual. And again, you've got these rings that interlock. And there was a lady who tried to get some of this stuff out, called Dr. Valerie Sinison. And she was director of the Clinic for Dissociative Studies in London. And she told the UK Daily Express newspaper how Savile had raped a 12-year-old girl in a satanic ritual at Stoke Mandeville Hospital. Now, Stoke Mandeville is a famous hospital that works with paraplegics and people who've got massive physical problems. And he did a lot of his charity work, Jimmy Savile, in his marathons that he used to do for Stoke Mandeville. And he was there a lot. And this is what Dr. Valerie Sinison told the Daily Express about this 12-year-old. She recalled being led into a room that was filled with candles on the lowest level of the hospital, somewhere that was not regularly used by staff. Several adults were there, including Jimmy Savile, who, like the others, was wearing a robe and a mask. She recognized him because of his distinctive voice, and it was distinctive, and the fact that his blonde hair, also distinctive, was protruding from the side of the mask. He was not the leader, but he was seen as important because of his fame, Sinison said. She was molested, raped, and beaten, and heard words that sounded like Ave Satanas, a Latinized version of Hail Satan, being chanted. There was no mention of any other child being there, and she cannot remember how long the attack lasted, but she was left extremely frightened and shaken. Well, you would be. And then Dr. Sinison said that a second Savile victim contacted her in 1993 and described how she'd been lent out at a party at a London house in 1980. Quoting Sinison, the first part of the evening started off with an orgy, but halfway through, some of the participants left. Along with other young women, the victim was shepherded to wait in another room before being brought back to find Savile in a master of ceremonies kind of role, with a group wearing robes and masks. She too heard Latin chanting and instantly recognized Satanist regalia. Although the girl was a young adult, she was above the age of consent. She had suffered a history of sexual abuse and was extremely vulnerable. So you have this guy. This just shows you, because the reason I use this Savile example in the book in such detail is because it is a perfect example of what's happening all over the world. And here you had a guy, famous, well-known, in a circle of the British royal family, who was involved in record-breaking pedophilia and Satanism, and died without the vast, overwhelming majority of the population, almost everybody, even knowing that that's what he was involved in. And that is the scale to which this stuff can be covered up. And we're seeing with the Epstein stuff in America now, the less than brilliant effort in this case to cover up what happened and the people involved. Edward Heath was someone in the 1990s, as I was investigating all this, who came up again and again from people who said they'd been abused by Edward Heath. And this is the guy that I had the very strange experience with in a Sky News studio when I was a spokesman for the Green Party, in which the guy's eyes turned completely black.